All right, everybody, welcome to our webinar. We're really delighted to have Asher and Mo run this webinar for us. And I think there are a few people who'll be joining us later. But I wanted to, first of all, just hand over to Asher, who is the North American Regional Chairperson for the Global Mobility Solutions Practice Group. So Asher, if you'd like to take it over and perhaps say a few words about yourself, and also Mo, you could also introduce yourself.
Sure. So maybe my greatest claim to fame is being the North American chair of the Global Mobility Solutions Practice Group. I am a partner in a law firm in Toronto, Canada, Devery Smith Frank. I'm a partner in the immigration law group. I practice exclusively in immigration law for, I don't want to tell you how many years, but let's just say more than 30. I'm admitted to practice both in Canada and the United States. And I certainly keep on top of Canadian immigration and certain parts of US immigration as well. And now, Mo, I turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Asher, and thank you, Linda. So my name is Mo Syed. I'm based in the Washington, D.C. area. I'm a U.S. immigration lawyer. I work with a law firm called Offit Kurman. It's a big full-service law firm. We cover pretty much a majority of the northeastern U.S. We have offices in New York and then several cities going down to the North Carolina, Charlotte area. So we do have expertise in various, corporate litigation and a wide number of other areas. My own expertise is primarily in representing companies, multinational, small, medium, large, US-based, overseas-based, in various types of immigrant and non-immigrant visas. I also do a good amount of family-based work, so families from pretty much all over the world, based on all the different family criterias. So happy to be here. Exciting times in the U.S. Post-election, inauguration, and so would love to hear some of your questions and hopefully be able to give you some useful information.
Okay, shall we jump in?
Let's go.
Linda, was there anything else you wanted to do from a housekeeping point of view?
Sorry, let me unmute myself there. I've actually just muted everybody so that the two of you can talk, but I wanted to let everyone know that if you want to say anything, please feel free to unmute yourself, or you can enter a question into the chat box.
Okay, well, it looks like we have representatives from various countries, and what Mo and I wanted to accomplish today is to present some sort of a comparative webinar where we're comparing the responses of both Canada and the United States to COVID-19 pandemic. Needless to say, global mobility, which is the purpose of our practice group, has been significantly impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. And what we've done is we've divided the topic up into approximately 4 or 5 sections in chronological order, where we each propose to present our country's perspective and response within those sections. And then we'd like to open it up to questions, and if at any time somebody wants to jump in with a comment, that would be great. But I think it would be more useful to let Mo and me finish off our presentation, And we hope to allow ample time at the end for discussion and dialogue. So the chronological order of the presentation is as follows. We'll start with pre-departure COVID-19 testing requirements. Then we'll go into entry restrictions. So before you can even board the flight, you need to know that there are restrictions which must be overcome. These restrictions have exemptions. Then once you arrive, there are post-entry quarantine requirements and exemptions to the quarantine requirements. So there's a chronological sequence to the discussion. Obviously, each area in itself could be the topic of a webinar of an hour. So we're just going to try to take, Mo and I ran some practice sessions, and we decided from a timing perspective, if we would each spend approximately 3 minutes per section, hopefully we can bring our presentation in under about a half an hour, 35 minutes, and leave a good 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions from the group, questions and comments. We're also very interested to hear how your country is dealing with some of these issues. So I'm going to turn it over to Mo to open up and present some pre-departure COVID testing requirements, which are relatively new both in Canada and the United States.
Okay, thanks. I was just unmuting myself. So thank you for that, Asher. So from the US perspective, we have recently had some developments. One of them was the lifting of the announcement of lifting the ban from Schengen countries and a few other countries from the UK, etc. So which is good news. Now, what we have also starting tomorrow, which is the pre-departure COVID-19 testing for passengers that are boarding flights bound for the US. So the Center for Disease Control in the US issued an order on January the 12th, which goes into effect actually tomorrow, the January the 26th, which requires a standard COVID test, PCR or antigen test within 3 days of the flight. Okay, so this is something new. The order does not specify who does the testing. We do know that it's up to the airlines to enforce the testing, to screen passengers before allowing them to board planes. We do have some precedent, basically in terms of airports where some of this type of process has already been, tested. It's like, for example, Heathrow Airport for a while now at Terminal 2 and Terminal 5, they have been doing testing at the airport, and they give the test to passengers before they board a plane. Now, obviously, this was not in place for US, this was in place for other destinations, but this is now going to be in place for the US as well. Just a basic sort of idea of what the considerations are. Historically, the airlines, have been hurt very badly due to the reduction in travel and the travel bans. So the airlines have really been pushing for quite some time the idea of pre-flight testing, so that as the tests become more accurate or more widely available, that the bans be lifted and pre-flight testing be instituted so that folks can travel more easily. So overall, we'll get to more detail as Asher and I discuss this issue in terms of how the airlines will implement these and what the exemptions, etc., are. Now, at the same time that I mentioned, this is the COVID-related bans on China and Iran are still in place, while the others may be lifted very soon. I mean, they've announced that they will lift them, but the implementation is yet to happen. So I think with that, Asher, I will turn it to you.
Okay, so we've had pre-boarding testing in place now for several weeks, since the beginning of January. And we have some very specific instructions as to what the testing consists of. Similar to what Mo described, it has to be done within 72 hours prior to departure. It's got nothing to do with when you land in Canada. It's prior to departure time. And the types of tests are very specific. They're basically molecular tests, and the two predominant ones are PCR and something known as RT-LAMP, L-A-M-P. I have the full wording of what the acronyms stand for, both with respect to PCR and LAMP, but I'm not going to bore you with them. So specific tests must be done, and they must be done in recognized laboratories. And Canada has on its website a list by country of acceptable laboratories. And I doubt that the test which Mo described, which is being administered at the airport in the UK, would be acceptable for this purpose. Now, there are certain exemptions for from the test. And maybe once it's rolled out in the United States, you'll find that the exemptions are similar. So first of all, it's only relevant to individuals 5 years of age or older. Children under 5 do not require the test. Anyone who's transiting through Canada does not require the test. Crew members don't require the test. And there are other types of individuals, emergency service personnel, some government officials under certain circumstances. Just as an anecdote, I had a situation on Friday. Oh, by the way, this is relevant to any traveler to Canada, including Canadian citizens. So Canadians are not exempt. And even if someone recently had a vaccine, they're still subject to this COVID-19 testing. So I had an interesting situation very quickly on Friday where an individual was coming to Canada from the United States, went to the airport in Chicago O'Hare and was denied boarding because the report that the person had did not meet the requirements. It did not specify the lab, and it did not specify the type of test. And I don't know if any of you have ever been stuck in O'Hare. To get out of the airport, to get back to the lab, to get them to redo it, and to go back to the airport, chances are you'll have missed your flight. So my suggestion to the individual was, why don't you hop in a car, drive from Chicago to Canada? The closest border, I believe, was Windsor, Detroit. Hop on a train. He was destined to a client in Montreal. Either fly domestically or hop on a train from Windsor to Montreal. So the moral of this is that the COVID testing requirement currently is only for air travel and does not apply to land border currently. Okay, Mo, I'll turn it over to you for the next segment. Oh, you have to, Mo, you have to unmute yourself. Mo.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks. All right, good.
I
Okay.
get worried when I see mouths moving and no sound coming through.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if it's my hearing. Okay,
No. You're fine. Okay, here we go. Okay, so yeah, that's interesting. I mean, so one of the differences with the U.S. is that the exemptions. So the U.S. order applies to passengers age 2 and above. So we are going to younger humans, and the exemptions are for crew members that are basically following specified protocols, COVID patients that are being transported with the CDC authorization, and then federal law enforcement and military personnel. Other than that, all passengers, including U.S. citizens and U.S. permanent residents, must comply. I'm going to go to entry restrictions, and in that space, it'd be interesting to compare and contrast with Canada as well. So the main restriction that we have that's health and safety related is at the northern and southern border. So the U.S. border with Canada and with Mexico. So right now, the borders are closed. So they're not, the travel is not as it is on airlines. So Canadians can get on a plane and come to the U.S., whereas like crossing over from the border by car is different. Whether or not the border crossings will change is still not known. The Department of State is expected to come up with some guidelines that describes what, if any, changes may occur. But for now, it's going to remain the same. Now, the next thing is that even though the Trump administration has, these are, so there's two different bans. One is like the sort of country of origin ban, and then there's the presence ban. So if you've been in a particular part of the world, like Schengen, UK, Brazil, and a bunch of other countries, then if you've been in there for 14, if you've been there within the last 14 days, then you're not, you're restricted from entry to the US. Now, even though the Trump administration said that they were lifting the ban partially, I believe the Biden administration is thinking about it, and indications are that that because Biden has a more cautious approach to COVID, he may actually choose to keep those in place, the ones that deal with this presence within the last 14 days. So we expect that on February the 3rd, we may have some more information. But for now, it seems very likely that those restrictions will stay in place, and we may get South Africa added to the list. So what makes it what is important then, having said that, is that folks that were in the past required to get a national interest exemption or the essential employee exemption in order to come into the US because they were otherwise subjected to bans, that they should still continue doing this for another couple of weeks. The last thing there is that the U.S. embassies are still, entertaining emergency visa appointments and case-by-case emergency requests, as well as requests for essential healthcare workers, etc. So, but it's not 100% clear how it's going to look. So we'll have to just keep a lookout for more news down the road. So, sure.
Yep. So to distinguish Canada's approach from the United States, I'm hearing feedback. Okay, now it's gone. While in the United States, as Mo described, the travel restrictions are country-based, so that if you were in a certain country for 14 days prior to departure to the United States, you're basically banned. That left over many countries that are not subject to that travel restriction. such as Australia, Mexico, New Zealand, Israel, just to give a few examples of countries that were not included. I believe it was primarily, in terms of Europe, the Western European countries, in addition to Brazil and some other countries, China, of course, that were added on after. In Canada, we treat the whole world as one. Basically, in order to come to Canada, one must demonstrate an essential purpose. However, there is a distinction between one seeking entry to Canada from the United States versus seeking from anywhere else in the world. Also, there is no distinction whether the travel to Canada is by air or by land. Mo distinguished, for example, for Canadians, they have difficulty crossing the land border, whereas it's very easy for a Canadian to hop on a flight and fly to the United States, because Canada is not one of the countries which are included in the travel ban. On the other hand, travel over the land border between Canada and the United States is based on agreement. And both Canada and the United States have agreed to preclude any cross-border travel which is non-essential. What is considered essential? There's a whole list of activities. I'll just give you a couple of examples. So for example, if someone is overseas and has a work permit, that is considered essential, and that person would be able to board a flight to Canada and seek entry to Canada, assuming that that job is still available. So if due to COVID, the employer has closed down, either permanently or temporarily, and that information is apparent to immigration, and they'll usually ask, is your employer still active? And in fact, they can call the employers if they wish. Then if that's the case, then that's considered essential. So anybody with a work permit abroad. There are work permit exempt activities that one does not require a work permit to come to Canada. So for example, there's something called after sales service. If a Canadian company purchases industrial equipment from a vendor overseas, and the Canadian company requires employees of that vendor to come to Canada to install the equipment, then that is an activity which is considered as an exemption to the travel restriction. And that type of an individual can travel to Canada. So then we have other types of exemptions for students. Someone who has a study permit or a student visa, and the school is actually active. There are many schools which have closed down during COVID. Or for example, if the school is running virtually, not in person, then the likelihood is that individual will not be permitted to board the flight and will not be permitted entry to Canada. And then we have some special exemptions for family reunification. Under certain circumstances, individuals, notwithstanding the travel restriction, may come to Canada for family reunification purposes. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Again, the whole area of restrictions to the travel, restrictions and exemptions to travel restrictions can be the subject of an entire webinar by itself. Our purpose is just to give you a taste of the restrictions in Canada and the United States, and again, to distinguish between the two countries. Mo?
Okay, yeah, very interesting stuff there, Asher. Some of the issues that come up that we are required to help our clients. They require a lot of innovation, and it's like a moving target at this point. So now let's focus a little bit on the actual the pre-boarding airline screening, some of the technicalities in terms of like what are the specific types of documents, how the process will work, etc. And I'd love to hear about how the Canadian side of this is working out. So just to clarify a few basics, right? So the order applies to all flights into the U.S., whether private or charter flights and commercial flights. It does not apply to travel within the U.S. or travel from a U.S. territory or possession, right? So we have the U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and a few others. So this will not apply to those. For connecting flights, the documentation requirements will apply to the initial flight. Okay, so if the connecting flights were booked together and each connection is 24 hours or less, and the passengers must receive instructions on safety protocol for the connections. All right, so that's some useful information there. Now, in a nutshell, the airline has to view the results for the testing, and passengers cannot check in without this. All right, and it's the airline carrier's responsibility to verify passenger COVID documentation. So this is airlines, aircraft operators, and they need two things, like one of two things, like either the COVID test or a recovery verification. All right, so the passengers have to present acceptable testing or recovery proof, and the passengers also have to complete a attestation to the CDC that verifies that these results that they're providing are truthful and accurate. Which means a sworn declaration that can be the basis of penalties if it turns out to be false. The documentation for both of these, either the negative pre-departure test or a proof of recovery, must have the name and date of birth of the passenger, which matches the passenger's travel documents. So travelers that have some variation have to be mindful of this requirement, so that they can avoid being refused boarding. Okay, now what documentation do they need to show? So they have to show a paper or an electronic version of a negative COVID-19 test, which is taken within the 3 calendar days prior to departure. Okay, the test must be a viral detection test, and this is defined as a nucleic acid amplification, or NAAT, or a viral antigen test. Okay, and there's some technical specifications. Basically, the result must state one of a handful of phrases which are acceptable, and those are negative, SARS-CoV-2 RNA not detected, SARS-CoV-2 antigen not detected, or COVID-19 not detected. And just the last bit here, so that's on the negative testing. The other set of documents pertains to proof of recovery. They need a written or electronic positive test that was taken within 3 months preceding the flight. Then the test must state the same technical terms that I stated before, but basically it's going to say kind of the reverse, like positive SARS-CoV-2 RNA detected, SARS-CoV-2 antigen detected, or COVID-19 detected. And then last thing with this particular prong is a letter from a licensed healthcare professional that's signed. It's on their official letterhead that says that the passenger is cleared for travel. And it should have the contact information for the healthcare provider. Just in conclusion, the airlines will administer this process. This typically will look like a desk before the boarding desk that will review and then approve passengers for boarding, and then presumably there will be a link to the Customs and Border Protection to resolve any sort of ambiguities or questions that might arise. So that's how it looks like from the U.S. perspective, and I will turn it over to Asher.
There we go. Okay, so in Canada, we have made the airlines much more responsible. We have tasked them with much more than what Mo has described. The US has tasked their airline agents. Of course, similar to what Mo described, the airline has to be satisfied that the COVID testing, which was done, is satisfactory, meets all the requirements. And I just told you before the story about the individual who was denied boarding at O'Hare. But in addition, our airlines are subject to heavy duty fines for bringing someone to Canada whom they should not have brought. So in essence, to a certain extent, Canada has made the airline agents into immigration officers. So the airline is also responsible for ensuring that anyone who wishes to board the flight also meets an exemption to the travel restrictions. And that's created a lot of problems for us because, as I mentioned, the airlines are subject to heavy duty fines. At the beginning of COVID, back in March, April, May of last year, there was a story which circulated around through all of the airlines. It was British Airways that brought 3 executives to Canada. I believe it was to Toronto. And immigration found the individuals inadmissible because they did not meet any exemption to the travel restrictions. It was not felt that their purpose in coming to Canada was essential. And the airline was fined by Canada $6,000 per individual, so $18,000 for bringing these 3 executives to Canada. And I believe that information spread like a pandemic, to use a bad pun or bad notion, throughout all of the airlines. And the airlines are very careful about whom they allow to board. And I think the policy is, when in doubt, deny boarding. Now, the airline agents have a direct pipeline to our equivalent of CBP. We call them CBSA, which stands for Canada Border Services Agency. They are the immigration people whom you meet at the airports or at the land borders, and some of them are stationed overseas as well. So if an airline agent is in doubt and is inclined to try to find out whether or not this person can truly be admitted on board, then they do have resources available to get information and to reduce their exposure to liability if they do receive an approval from the CBSA. What we do is we equip clients with a letter or a memo to the airline agents explaining why we feel they're eligible for an exemption and why we feel they're eligible to be boarded on the flight. I've seen some letters done by some other immigration lawyers. They do, I don't know, I think they think they're writing to immigration, to a USCIS or immigration in Canada, and they produce, 5-6 page submission letters. that generally speaking, the airlines have no appetite to read and, you know, just ignore it. I've got it down to a one-page memo with the salient points of why I think the person is admissible, and so far it's worked really well for clients. In terms of pre-boarding airline screening, we have developed, the Canadian government has developed an app. It's called ArriveCan, ARRIVECAN. You can Google it, you'll find it almost immediately. And it's mandatory for any traveler coming to Canada by air, that is, not necessarily by land, to download the ArriveCan before going to the airport. I see some of you are looking at your computers. I'm assuming you're looking for it. And answer all of the questions. It's a pretty thorough questionnaire. It asks questions about exposure to COVID, any symptoms. It asks questions about travel itinerary. So one of the very useful things about the app is for tracing purposes. If someone should fall ill while in Canada and they don't know when it started, they can go back and trace through the ArriveCan itinerary. It also requires the individual to provide a quarantine plan, which Mo and I will get into shortly. Now, there are certain exemptions from the ArriveCan, like everything else. It's got its exemptions also, but as a general rule, everyone is required to download and complete the app. It generates a receipt at the end, and you can show the receipt to the airline personnel either electronically on your phone, or you can actually print out the receipt. If you don't have a smartphone and you complete the app online on a desktop computer or some other device, then you get a receipt and you can show the airline that you've completed the app. So I think that segues us into the next session, which perhaps will be our final section, which is post-entry quarantine requirements. Mo, why don't you start with that, and then I'll...
Yeah, so thank you. In the US, we, I think, we have like each state and local area has its own quarantine requirements. So, generally, yes, there is a federal guideline. However, each individual state can set its own quarantine very strict or not so strict. So it really looks at an examination of each and every state. For example, New York generally has like a 10-day quarantine from people coming in from other states, and then it also matters if what the adjoining state is doing. Sometimes if you're coming in from certain states, there's more restriction versus if you're coming in from like close proximity. So yeah, so that's pretty much really all that I will say on that topic. It's a state-by-state examination. So yeah.
Okay. So in Canada, it's very different. I hope you're not sick and tired of hearing me say that throughout this webinar. It's federal law, and it's applicable across the country, regardless of which province, which city one is entering into Canada. It's a 14-day requirement of quarantine. Now, by way of introduction, people use the word isolation and quarantine interchangeably. And that's inaccurate, at least from the Canadian perspective. We have something called the Quarantine Act, which is federal law. and it distinguishes between isolation and quarantine. You know, even before I tell you the answer or what the distinction is, you think of isolation as being something more more draconian than quarantine. I don't know, the term isolate to me sounds much tougher and stricter than simple quarantine. And the answer is yes, that's exactly the case. Isolation under the Quarantine Act is something which is required of someone who has symptoms. Quarantine is someone who has no symptoms, but nevertheless is required to quarantine for 14 days. And there are distinctions under the Act between isolation and quarantine. So you remember before I mentioned that the ArriveCAN requires the individual to provide a quarantine plan. So one has to know with a relative amount of precision where one is going to quarantine. And again, the Act gives parameters. You can, in a household, it may be permissible. You can't in certain other environments where you could potentially expose someone else. And in fact, the government has places for quarantine if you don't have an acceptable location. We have hotels at government expense where people are forced to go to from the airport. There are reporting requirements. The government is very diligent in following up. I had kids of mine visit us from New York City during the summertime. Of course, my son is a Canadian citizen. That's how he was able to get into Canada and be accompanied by his US citizen spouse and dual citizen children. And they stayed with us, and we got calls every day from Health Canada wanting to know how's the quarantine going and are you still there, and wanting to speak to, well, they had their phone numbers, their cell numbers, and called them directly. And if you're not called, there's an obligation on the individual to report. They're given a toll-free number to call Health Canada to self-report. There are exemptions from the quarantine requirement, but I'm looking at my watch here, and I want to leave time for questions and also for Mo to leave us with some parting words. So the only thing of note that I'll point out to you is that 14 days is not a requirement if you intend to leave Canada during the 14 days. So as long as you go directly to the airport or to a land border, again, we're talking about somebody who was quarantining, in other words, did not show symptoms. If the person was in isolation because of showing symptoms, then it's true that person can also leave within the 14 days, but there are restrictions as to how that person can leave. You can't hop on a flight. It's got to be in a private vehicle, etc. So it's interesting to know that the 14-day requirement is not strictly required, as long as whenever you decide to leave, you go directly to your departure without making any intervening stops. So at this point, I would like to ask Mo if he could just give us some comments about what he sees happening under the new administration with respect to both COVID requirements and also perhaps some general proclamations which were implemented under the Trump administration, which may have some changes under Biden. Mo.
Sure, thanks, Asher. I'll try to keep it brief to allow time for audience questions. On the COVID-related measures, by all indications, Biden administration will take the more cautious approach. So it's very likely that the termination of the bans from Schengen and UK will be withdrawn. So I do expect Biden to be more cautious, and so we shouldn't see any dramatic shift. Next, overall in the immigration system, there's a document that's on the Biden website. That's his immigration plan. And what that talks about is pretty much like a night and day difference from the outgoing administration, which, the hallmark of the outgoing administration was the border wall with Mexico, keeping out immigrants and really targeting the idea that foreigners are taking away American jobs and such. So Biden has done a total sort of a shift away. And his plan talks about immigrants as the core of American growth, immigrant-driven businesses leading, development and innovation, and as such, to facilitate that process, what we expect is a shift away of resources from enforcement, deportation, removal. Which was really the main focus of the Trump administration, was detentions at the border, the children being separated from their parents, and just a huge big investment on measures that were enforcement driven. And what that did to the benefits processing, let's say work-based visas and work-based permanent residence, or even family-based benefits, two things happened. The staff that would work the cases were basically reassigned to the enforcement part. And then resources, money that's basically being earned by the service through applications that are filed with filing fees, rather than to use that money on processing those applications, that money was going towards the enforcement side. And then the requirements were heightened. So in the past, unless there was an indication of fraud, an application was processed, assuming that the documents were truthful. But what the Trump administration did was they basically assumed that every application is fraud. And so every application gets very heightened scrutiny. You interview each applicant, whether or not it's really required. And so everything had slowed down, really come down to a grinding halt. So the expectation now is that the shift will be away from enforcement and towards the processing of applications to catch up with the backlog, and to really help the employers, to help employees, their families. So there's a lot of hope right now that things will go back on track and become a more immigrant-friendly environment. So that's in a nutshell.
So as a parting contrast, while Mo seems to feel that things will ease up in response to COVID-19 in the Biden administration, in Canada, we're going in the opposite direction. Currently, there are 31 cases of the UK variant and 3 cases of the South African variant in Canada. Just over the weekend, there was an outbreak in a long-term facility here in Ontario, not far from Toronto, where I'm based. And they believe it is the UK variant, which spread through the home in a matter of hours. It's just unbelievable how fast this thing spread through. And there's great fear of the COVID strains, the variant COVID strains. Another big fear here in Canada right now is the upcoming March break. For those of you overseas who don't know what March break is, basically, it's cold here in Canada right now. We're in the height of winter, and every year in March, there's a break. Schools are closed for a couple of weeks, and families and students travel to warmer climates in the United States or Mexico. And there's huge concern that that type of international travel will bring additional exposure to Canada. Last week, the Canadian Prime Minister warned of the possibility of sudden new restrictions. Those were his words, sudden new restrictions. And it's possible, rumors are surfacing of a complete closure of the Canadian border, both to inbound travel and to outbound travel. We'll see what happens over the coming weeks. So in a nutshell, that's the situation. I hope we've given you a little bit of a taste of the difference of Canada's and the United States response to COVID-19. And I'd love to open up the floor for comments from anybody, or if anybody would like to tell us a bit about their own experiences, clients of theirs, or just to update us as to what's doing in their country. We'd welcome the opportunity. I guess you have to unmute yourself if you, or Linda, can you unmute everybody?
I can do that. Feedback might be actually a little bit bad, but let's see.
Well, we'll try.
I was actually going to invite maybe either Rika or Stefan to talk about their experience in Germany a little bit, just because they're supposed to be the light of the world, right? In the whole COVID thing for a while there, at least.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, of course I can say some words, but to be honest, I'm not, although we are in a global mobility practice group here, I'm not a specialist in immigration law. So both Rika and me work for KSP, and we're, let's call it specialists on global mobility tax issues. So before joining KSP, we've been working for a Big Four firm as global mobility managers for quite some years, and there was always a split between tax issues, social security is what we also cover, but from the immigration law perspective, there's no how to say valid information I can provide you with regarding Germany. Of course, there are daily changes in the news and in the regulations, and basically it's in Germany it's about countries being seen as risky country or non-risky countries. And right now, if you have a closer look at Europe, almost everything is quite risky. Only there's one country which is seen as with I think an extremely high risk, which is the UK right now, due to the mutations going around there, and they are also in Germany right now. But so it's I would call it some kind of a chaos. But Rika, please feel free to add your opinion on that, because it's from my position, it's only an opinion and not strict law or something like that.
Can I just jump in for a second? Mo, I believe, perhaps you can confirm, I believe Germany was indeed one of the countries included on the travel ban to the United States, and still is until it's removed by Biden, if it will be. Okay.
Yeah, okay. Seeing it from the other side, sure, definitely. So, and I think it's better for everyone, because we have quite high figures and numbers of COVID infections.
yeah, I mean, I have a couple of clients, some on the family side, like, U.S. citizens married to German nationals, so
Yeah.
they need proof of their relationship, and they've been able to travel. On the employment side, same deal, like German citizens that work for U.S. employers, we have to give them documentation that shows that they're essential employees. And so with those types of exemptions, they can travel with the the testing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I know
Thank
that
you.
for us, certainly going to Germany, which is our neighbor, we have to prove that we need to go there as well. It's pretty much the same in that sense, where we have to say, we're not going there for tourist reasons. Like there's, you have to be either going for work or to visit your family. I was going to ask just about the vaccination program. Maybe Mo and Asher, you could cover this, because I've seen quite a lot of it on LinkedIn where people are saying, you can't really force your employees to be vaccinated. But I'm wondering in terms of travel, because you were mentioning the COVID tests, how does it work with getting vaccination? Because as far as I know, you could still also transmit the virus, even though you're vaccinated. Is that not the case?
Well, I can tell you from the Canadian perspective, the vaccination does not, at least not currently, exempt one from the COVID test. So, and perhaps precisely for that reason, first of all, I believe both vaccinations, both the Pfizer and the Moderna, require a second dose. And, one can still be a carrier of the virus. And for that reason, at least under the Canadian guidelines, it does not serve as an exemption. It doesn't serve as an exemption to anything. Not only the COVID test requirement, but even the travel exemptions, travel restriction exemptions. Just because one has received a vaccination, one is not exempted from the travel restrictions to Canada. Well, anything from your end?
Yeah, so it's an evolving conversation, but I think all of what you've said applies. Same thing, like I think Linda, in terms of like, transmission is still going to be an issue. Like these people may not have symptoms and they're not going to likely end up in the ER after they get the vaccine, but they can still be at high risk for transmission. I think to the point about like requiring employees to get vaccinated or get tested, I guess, whatever. I've seen conversation because like my firm does a lot of employment law and they do a lot of employment law in multiple different states. And I believe that some states that, there's some variation. But I think there is agreement that, those types of industries where you are sort of customer facing, where, you have like a component of like additional risk, they are allowed, if there's like a strong reason, to have employees tested. Yeah, so that's kind of like the extent of my knowledge on that employee type of issue.
And I imagine there might be a significant distinction between requiring an employee to be tested versus requiring vaccination. Maybe something like a test, it is somewhat invasive, but not as invasive as getting a needle in the arm. And there may be distinctions. We're probably going to see some court cases litigating the issues, and employers forcing employees to do certain things, and employers being taken to human rights tribunals, and we'll probably see some decisions coming out with time.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine it also goes hand in hand with the because all of us work remotely. I mean, I do, and it's optional to go to work. And when I do, I need to fill out a questionnaire online that says like I have to declare that I don't have any symptoms, and then I can go into the office. But it's not required. But like for others that have to, like, you know, restaurant workers or other industries, and so there is a variation in there. And I think that Canada might have some interesting, you know, perspectives. I feel like in terms of like different sectors of the economy being open for business or not. That'd be interesting to see, Asher, like how you've seen different industries maybe shutting down and others being allowed to function.
Yeah, well, again, it's the same essential concept. So businesses which are quote unquote essential, and that's actually defined, businesses which relate to infrastructure, food, agriculture, etc., are all open for business. And unfortunately, many businesses have gone belly up as a result of COVID-related restrictions. Yeah, probably a very similar situation, not only to the United States, but around the world. We're seeing this phenomenon, people being laid off, unfortunately. And yeah, it's a horrible situation worldwide.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments?
Mo, actually, quick question for you. I think
Yeah.
in the beginning of this conversation, when we were talking about some of those pre-departure requirements for travel, one point that I thought was interesting between Canada and the US was that the type of test that needs to be done prior to departing on a flight, in Canada at least, there's a list of laboratories that the government's going to be using as like, hey, you know, if you get a test here, we will, you know, recognize the result of that test. And I think you had mentioned that there isn't that same guidance in the US. Do you see that changing? So, you know, maybe there will be a list of, hey, these are the laboratories to go to get the proper test for travel, or do you see that remaining kind of ambiguous like it is right now?
You know, that's a good question. I mean, you know, the kinds of factors that go into it, right, is the availability in different countries of different just the reliability and access that people have to different labs. So now there has been experience because other countries have required tests, right? So the US is not really the first one. So there are established tests that the airlines are recognizing. I mean, I do feel that there will be some initial time frame of some kind of confusion initially, and then slowly evolving some kind of consensus on labs that are reliable in particular countries, to have like sort of a country by country list of the acceptable laboratories for these tests. So yeah, I do think that eventually there will be some kind of clear guidance.
Great.
But
yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, even in Canada's case, Nico, when the requirement first came out, it was rolled out very quickly. The government gave like about a week's notice that this was going to come into effect. And there was a huge backlash by the airline industry and the travel industry in general. And some of the finer points, such as identifying laboratories, and initially the only test which was acceptable was the PCR test. And then once they got into it, they've identified a whole loop of subtests, types of PCR tests, and then this new LAMP test, which I mentioned earlier. So it evolved here in Canada also, and we have the benefit of being into it for close to a month now, a little over 3 weeks. So it's developed, and I'm sure it'll follow a similar course in the United States.
Great, thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Well, I'm just going to preempt you, Linda, and then I'll give you the last word. On Mo's behalf, I just want to thank GGI for hosting this and affording us the opportunity. I hope you found it useful, specifically within the context of the Global Mobility Solutions Group. And I think we have to look at opportunities to expand the group and become more active, get more people involved. I'd like to see my screen run out of room for this type of webinar in the future. And hopefully we can collaborate. As Mo and I were preparing for this webinar, a number of ideas came to us where we could do something similar from a comparative point of view on various aspects of immigration law. Canada has a very innovative immigration policy point system, which is in place, which the United States doesn't have. So there are things we can learn from each other, and part of the practice group might find of interest this kind of a comparative study. And Mo and I look forward to the opportunity to doing something like this again in the future. So we thank you.
From our side, we wanted to say thank you to you for actually getting this practice group kind of kicked off this year, because last year we didn't manage to have one for this practice group. So I hope we can cover a wide range of topics. And Stefan and Rika, this was their first one within GGI. Thank you for joining us. And Armin also, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate you guys taking the time. And certainly we can expand the focus of the practice group to cover your topics also. And hopefully we can also run a global webinar that covers many other jurisdictions. I think certainly in Europe, we also have quite a lot of things happening in this field, especially with Brexit. It's been so much fun reading all the things that have come to light with mobility. So from our side, particularly wanted to thank Asher and Mo for taking the initiative and getting us started this year. I hope that we can certainly get more of your colleagues involved and more of our other members involved. We do have an issue of Insider coming out in March, I think. Nico can correct me.
Yes,
I
March.
think it's March.
Yep. Mid-March.
Hopefully you got Insider in January. I'd really like to encourage you to think about submitting articles for the practice group. It's a really good way of getting your name out there, showing your expertise, and making sure that other GGI members also can learn about you and what you do. So on that note, I want to say thank you again, everybody, for joining us. We have this recorded, so we will try and get it edited and uploaded to our website shortly. Have a good day. Have a good week.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank you,
everybody.
everyone, for joining in.